Welcome to the lecture on tethered rationality. Now, most of you believe in a rational mind, the reasoning mind. You believe that volitional human behavior is a function of rationality or reason. I want to try to convince you that the idea of a purely rational mind or purely reasoning mind is a myth. We are certainly rational creatures, but our system of rationality is built on top of, tethered to, integrated with our evolutionary older systems. These ideas are laid out in some detail in my recent book, Reason and Less. I'm going to offer you a 45 to 50-minute sort of high-level walkthrough of these ideas. And if something is of interest, if you wish to explore something further, then you can go to the book. Now, the good thing is you do not actually have to buy the book to read it. It is available open access from the publisher's website. So you can download a chapter that might be of interest to you, or you can download the whole volume. Okay, let me begin. Let me begin with Francis Collins. In December 2021, Francis Collins, who was then the departing director of the NIH, shared his thoughts on some of the successes and regrets of his 12-year tenure at the head of the NIH, the largest medical psychological research facility in the world. Among his successes, he listed a number of significant advances in biomedical research. Among his regrets, he noted the following, and I want to use his own words here. So let me quote him. To have now 60 million people still holding off taking advantage of life-saving vaccines is pretty unexpected. It does make me at least realize, boy, there are things about human behavior that I don't think we had invested enough into understanding. So what he's saying is that human behavior during the pandemic, it's not that the models sort of miscalculated by a little bit. It's that we got it totally wrong. Our models of rationality, our models of human behavior were not even in the right ballpark to account for the behavior that ensued. My own crisis occurred some years earlier. Some years ago, it occurred to me that despite studying rationality and human behavior for 20 plus years, nothing I knew seemed particularly relevant to explaining the behavior of my teenage daughter, or the behavior of my Trump neighbors who profess an unshakable faith in American exceptionalism, but then go on to deny and ridicule the science of climate change emerging from exceptional American institutions. Or that given that only 3% of the American population consists of white men over 6 feet 4 inches tall, why is it that 30% of American Fortune 500 CEOs are white men over 6 feet 4 inches tall? Are they smarter than the rest of us? Well, it's logically possible, but there are probably better explanations. Or why intelligent, powerful men engage in sexual indiscretion, even assault, at great personal risk to themselves and harm to others. Or why I overindulge in chocolate cake and pizza despite being overweight. So when encountered with such dilemmas, standard models of reasoning and decision-making deal with them by placing certain constraints on human rationality. So these constraints are known in the literature in the fields as heuristics and biases, fast and slow, motivated reasoning, sloppy reasoning, poor education, perhaps even cognitive deficiency. And what these are is they're all cognitive tweaks to try and save us from irrationality. And they've been standard fares for decades, right? And I want to argue that these explanations do have some role to play in understanding human behavior. So it's not that I'm setting them totally aside. No, there's a role for them. But the point I'm going to focus on here is that for many real world behaviors, such as those I noted on the previous slide, they totally miss the mark. It's not they're off by a little bit. They totally miss the mark. They're not even in the right ballpark. So my concern here is not with irrational behavior, that is behavior due to failure of coherency, but rather irrational behavior. And by irrational behavior, I mean behavior driven or modulated by non-rational systems. So in terms of the overview of the talk, I want to first present to you the standard reasoning models and show you very briefly that they fail in many real-world situations. My common sense solution that I'm going to offer you is that reasoning systems are tethered to non-reasoning systems, and behavior is a blended response of these various systems. And this is what I call the tethered mind or tethered rationality. Now, how am I going to convince you of the tethered mind? Well, I'm going to make my case in the following way. First, I'm going to point to you towards data supporting the blended response hypothesis. Second, I will point to evolutionary and anatomical evidence for the tethered brain-mind. Third, I will discuss how these different systems communicate and interact. And then I will present the control structure of the tethered mind. That is, who is in charge of the tethered mind. And then finally, I will explain some real-world behaviors with the tethered mind and to show you that we get further ahead with it than with a purely rational mind. So let me begin. And my starting point is to recognize rationality. We are reasoning animals, no question about it. But our system of reason does not float above the biology. It is not powered by angel dust. It evolved on top of and is integrated into the neurobiology we share with our common ancestors, with bats and baboons. That is, our reasoning mind is tethered to evolutionary older systems, such as the autonomic system, the instinctive system, and associative system. To deny this is to deny the theory of evolution and 150 years of neurobiology. So I take this to be a truism. And I'm willing to bet that most of you also take it to be a truism. Now, furthermore, I want to say that this tethering is not a flaw in the system to be ignored as noise or a finer-grained question for another day. It is fundamental to understanding human behavior. The question is, how do we cash this out in terms of a model? My response is the model of tethered rationality, where human behavior is a blended response of reasoning and non-reasoning systems. Now, I want to note that this is a very old idea that the social sciences have cast aside over the past 70-odd years, and to our detriment, I think. So let's begin by noting what reason or rationality is. So as I've said, volitional human behavior is explained in terms of reason or rationality. And by this, it is meant that our actions are a function of three things: beliefs, goals and desires, and a principle of coherence. So the idea is that the principle of coherence allows us to select actions consistent with our goals, given our beliefs. And coherence here is an intuitive notion, meaning roughly making sense. It's a relationship between mental states with propositional contents and more generally propositions. It can be further subdivided into semantic, logical, conceptual, and causal coherence. Now here, let me give you an example of the untethered reasoning mind at work. Okay, so this is an example of judges making parole decisions. And I said, noted on the previous slide, that there are three components to the reasoning mind: goals and desires, beliefs, and the coherence relation. And you can see each of these on this in this diagram. So the judge will have certain goals and desires. They may be such things as upholding the law, protecting society. They will have certain beliefs based upon the information they've been provided. And these beliefs could be things such as the applicant has served the mandatory minimum sentence, was an exemplary prisoner, is not likely to reoffend, and there is no objecting statement from the victim. And then the goals and the goals, desires, the beliefs come together in this coherence relation. And is it reasonable to grant parole in this situation? Now, I want you to notice several things about this model. First, only the reasoning mind can do this. Okay, so it is critical to who and what we are. Secondly, the only thing that you need to do to change behavior on this model is to change beliefs. And this is why we hang on to this model. This is why the social sciences will not let it go, irrespective of any evidence that you might present them. Because if there's some unacceptable behavior that we, as a society, deem undesirable. Well, if it's a function of the rational mind, then all we have to do to change it is to change beliefs. The third thing to note here about this model is that it is an extreme abstraction that just floats above the biology. It is totally disconnected from the explanation we offer for non-human animals, right? The totally different explanations are offered. So let me offer you the first data point here to show you that this model has some very serious shortcomings. Again, I'm using the same example, judges making parole decisions, and here we've got the same model, same diagram as on the previous slide. So the data point I want to introduce is a study published by Danziger et al. In 2011. He studied the behavior of parole judges. And what he noted is that favorable parole rulings after a food break, when the judges were well fed, were about 65%. However, they approached zero prior to a food break when the judges were hungry. So the reasoning mind cannot explain this unless we say it's just noise. One possible explanation for this is low blood sugar levels are modulating the reasoning process. But how do low blood sugar levels intervene in this model? What are they doing? Are they going down into the neurobiology, finding the beliefs and changing them? It's absurd. So what we need is a type of model where we can accommodate both reasoning systems, such as the model presented here, and non-reasoning systems, and tell a story whereby they can interact. That is, reasoning and non-reasoning systems can interact. Okay, so let's also clarify what we mean by reasoning and non-reasoning systems. So non-reasoning systems are autonomic systems, instinctive systems, and associative systems. Reasoning systems are cognitive systems. These systems have been studied for the past 150 years. And on this slide, I'm showing you some of the key players, the giants in the field that have advanced our knowledge of these various systems. The second thing that I want to show you on this slide is that the mechanisms, both conceptually and neurologically, the mechanisms underlying these systems differ. So autonomic systems are about reflex arcs and homeostasis. Instinctive systems are about fixed action patterns triggered by reward and arousal systems. Associative systems are about learning through reinforcement, that is, co-occurrence relations. And reasoning systems or cognitive systems are about coherence relations between propositional attitudes. Now, if we look at the sort of the history of psychology over the past 100, 150 years, it's been a squabble, a giant battle over which is the correct mechanism, right? So these systems, as we note on the previous slide, have been articulated by some of the smartest people who've ever lived, truly giants in the field. But they all made one and the same human mistake. They assumed they were completely right and everyone else was completely wrong. It did not occur to them that they were just explaining different types of behavior or different aspects of behavior. Go back to the literature, the historical literature, and look at the great battles of the 20th century between Lorenz, Skinner, Chomsky. They did not argue that the cognitive systems can explain these aspects of behavior, whereas these other aspects of behavior are better explained by associationism or through instinctive mechanisms. No, it was all or nothing. Each one argued that they were totally right. The other one was, if not completely wrong, the accounts that they were offering, the mechanisms they were offering, were inconsequential to explain human behavior. So my first contribution here is the obvious, is to simply note that all of these systems have a distinct role to play in human behavior. The question is not which one is the correct mechanism, but how they interact to generate behavior. The other point that I want to note here is that each of these four systems are differentiated along the following lines. So in terms of what is the function of the behavior, what is the origin of the behavior, how tight is the causal coupling between stimulus and response, and what are the underlying mechanisms of the behavior? What brain structures realize these mechanisms? So answers to these five questions are relevant to the details of the story, but clearly in this lecture, we're not going to dive into these details. You're welcome to look at the relevant chapters as your interest moves you. The second point I want to emphasize here before we move forward is that these are different systems, but they're also integrated into each other. Okay. So to look ahead, where am I going with this? Well, where I'm going is to try to convince you of a model of behavior, the model of the tethered mind, where we have each of these systems, autonomic systems, instinctive systems, associative systems, and reasoning systems. These are all activated in any given situation. The extent of their activation will depend on the particulars of the environment that the organism is functioning in. And they all generate a response. However, the organism's behavior, is guided by a single response. And so there is some sort of utility function, integration function, that takes the input from these various systems and generates a behavioral response. So this is the type of model that we're heading towards. Now, to convince you of this type of model, what I need to do and what I'm going to do is first, point you towards data supporting the blended response hypothesis. Second, point you towards data supporting the joint emergence of certain behaviors and corresponding neuroanatomical structures along the phylogenetic tree. And third, provide you with a lingua franca for communications across multiple systems. Fourthly, provide you with a control structure for the tethered mind. And finally, I will show you how the model explains some of the examples I'm concerned about better than standard models. Okay, so data supporting blended response hypothesis. So first of all, just some very intuitive examples. Look at the interaction of autonomic and instinctive systems. Well, low blood sugar levels triggers food foraging behavior. Autonomic and reasoning systems. The parole judge's data that we discussed a few slides ago shows this. Instinctive and associative systems. Well, here let's look at an animal example. Learning of songs in male zebra finches. The production of the song is instinctive, but it's fine-tuned based upon hearing the father's song. Instinctive and reasoning minds. Well, a simple intuitive example. I'm terrified of lions, and yet I will go to the zoo and stand in front of a lion cage. And the reason I will do that is my reasoning mind knows that the lion is in the enclosure, and the enclosure is built in such a way that it cannot reach me, and I'm perfectly safe. But in the book, more formally, the way I make this case is by drawing upon data from economic decision-making tasks. In particular, I draw upon data from cooperative economic decision making. And here I'm referring to the behavioral economists, people like Ernst Fehr, Fischbacher, Novak, and so forth. And so these people, there's a very large literature on this. It's got several hundred papers, perhaps thousands of papers. So we're not talking about a single study here. We're talking about a large body of study. So these economists study tasks such as the dictator game, the ultimatum game, trust game, and social dilemma games. And if you know anything about these games, you will know that they cannot be explained just in terms of rationality. We don't even come close. Now, if you're not familiar with these games, just bear a minute with me. On the next slide, I'm going to illustrate the blended response hypothesis with a much more intuitive example. But so just bear with me if you're not familiar with the games. So given that behavior on these games cannot be explained in terms of rational models, what these economists are doing is they're postulating what they call traits, and what I would, on my vocabulary, I would refer to as instincts. And the particular instincts or traits they are postulating are self-maximization, fairness, cheating, cheater detection, and punishment. Now, they don't provide a great deal of evidence that these are indeed good candidates for instincts. They rely largely on computer simulations. So one thing that I do is I marshal evidence that these are indeed good criteria for instincts. And I do this by asking the following 5 questions. First, is the trait present in all human societies? Second, are there variants of it on other branches of the phylogenetic tree? Third, does it emerge early in human infants prior to any opportunity for extensive socialization? Fourth, is it underwritten by implicit autonomic low-level mechanisms? And 5, is there dedicated neural circuitry for it? Now, I argue that for most of these questions, not all, we don't know enough about the neural circuitry, but for the other questions, we can answer yes to this. And if we answer yes to most or all of these questions, then the trait in question is a good candidate for an instinct. If we answer no to most of these questions, then it is not. So I argue that these are indeed good candidates for instincts. However, it needs to be noted that if one relies just on these mechanisms, one still cannot fully explain the behavior on these cooperative economic decision-making games. One also needs to appeal to beliefs or reason-based interjections. And the most common appeal here in this literature is to reputation. Okay, so essentially what's going on here in this literature is they're appealing to both cognitive and non-cognitive systems and giving what I refer to as a blended response explanation for the behavior. And trying to explain these data without the postulation of beliefs and reason is as futile as trying to explain it without the postulation of instincts. Okay, so as I said, if you're not familiar with that literature, let me give you a much more intuitive example of what I mean by a blended response hypothesis. So this is a study we did in our lab some years ago. It's a study on selecting a leader. We brought in participants and we told them that there is a election for the mayor of Toronto, and what are some of the issues that you're interested in? What is it that you would like to see the candidates do? And we divided this up into 5 categories. education, transportation, security, environment, and employment. And what we found, and we asked them under each of these situations, what would you like to see the candidates do? And they told us, and we made a note of these. And based on the information we collected from a large body of students, we produced these cards in which we listed the 5 categories. We listed the name of a candidate, the 5 categories, and their position on each of the categories. Okay, there were no pictures on the cards, and then we brought the participants in again, and we asked them on a scale of 1 to 7, how likely are you to vote for this a particular candidate? And they told us, and by and large, what they told, what the way they voted was in terms of the positions of the candidates on education, transportation, security, environment, and employment. And this is the rational thing to do, right? You want to vote for candidates who are going to do things that are beneficial to you, that you want to see done. And so this is not a surprise. However, we had the participants come back in a couple of weeks, and we showed them cards again and asked them to again note on a scale of 1 to 7 how likely they are to vote for a particular candidate. But this time we also had pictures attached to the cards. And these were not just arbitrary pictures, these were pictures that were pre-selected for alpha male cues, the presence or absence of alpha male cues from another pilot study. What do you think happened? Well, what you can see here happened is that it's not that the candidates totally switched their position. No, based on the degree of the absence or presence of alpha male cues, in the absence of alpha male cues, they deviated away from the rational response. It's not that they flipped; they swayed away. Okay, it took so in the maybe if they were willing to vote for a particular candidate in the absence of alpha male cues, maybe that candidate needed to click all 5 buttons for them, and even then they may not. They may give them a 3 or 4 out of 7. But a candidate with the alpha male cues, even if they only clicked 1 or 2 points or 3 points, they would get a higher rating. Okay, so this is what I mean when I'm talking about a blended response hypothesis. So behavior, consequential real-world human behavior, is a function of both rational and non-rational systems. Okay, the second data point that we want to address is data supporting the joint emergence of certain behaviors and corresponding neuroanatomical structures along the phylogenetic tree. So here I've got a diagram showing you the evolution of brains. So all vertebrate brains consist of a spinal cord, myencephalon, metencephalon, mesencephalon, diencephalon, and telencephalon. And you can see these structures on the reptile brain here. I've labeled them here for you. Now, at every branch of the phylogenetic tree, certain brain structures are conserved and propagated, are conserved, while others are added, modified, and expanded in new directions. And you can see this again going from the reptile brain to the rodent brain and the bird brain. Here we are seeing that largely the brainstem diencephalon structures are largely conserved. I mean, there are some modifications, but they're largely conserved. But the telencephalon is added, modified to, and expanded in new directions. Furthermore, you can see at different branches of the tree, the additions, modifications, and expansions are quite different. They differ. Mm-hmm. And then you can see further from the rodent brain to the human brain, further extensive additions, modifications, and expansions, largely confined to the telencephalon. So this is the first point I want to note. I also want to note that it's also the case that certain behaviors are preserved at branching points, while others are added, modified, and expanded in new directions. And the correspondence between anatomy and behavior is not an accident. Hierarchically organized behaviors are underwritten by hierarchically organized brain systems. And we can see this in both the hierarchy of brain structures and behavior in the human brain here. So here I'm showing you the brainstem, diencephalon, subcortical structures, and cortical structures in these four diagrams. And you can see just very briefly, the brainstem is associated with autonomic systems. It's a pathway for conducting sensory information, including pain and pleasure. Diencephalon, major relay center for sensory information, also for homeostasis functions and essential survival behaviors. Subcortical structures encode instinctive behaviors. The hippocampus lays down associative memories, and the cerebral cortex is associated with higher level cognitive or reasoning functions. But the second point, sort of having said that, associating different systems that have a different evolutionary history with different behaviors, the second point I want to make is that is in terms of the tethering or the integration. Every little behavior, from sort of wiggling my little finger here, involves involves activation of cortex right down to spinal cord. So we can see in terms of wiggling my finger, we've got cerebral cortex, motor area, thalamus, basal ganglia, brainstem, spinal cord, cerebellum, everything, right? So this is integration. And the point here is that we know this. This is not new. This is a diagram from a first year biology textbook. So there's nothing new here. And yet we forget when we think about reasoning and rationality. So, given this this sort of data from the evolutionary literature, that is, the evolution of brains, the type of model that I'm moving towards is something like this. So here we've got sort of different brain structures. We've got sort of the brainstem, diencephalon, subcortical structures, and primary cortex, secondary cortex, and associative cortex. We also have different neuronal properties associated with these brain structures. So we've got, in terms of the brainstem, diencephalon, subcortical structures, we typically refer to these neurons as hardwired. And secondary cortex, associative cortex, we typically refer to as softwire. These are unfortunate terms. The vocabulary that I want to use comes from Greenough, and he introduces the terms experience expectant networks and experience dependent networks. And so the idea is that these networks here are largely genetically programmed, and then there are some minor parameter settings based on environmental interaction. The networks in terms of cortex, certainly secondary and associative cortex, are experience-dependent networks. They are sort of very roughly configured in terms of genetic instructions, but then they are fine-tuned or sculpted through interaction with the environment postnatally. And again, we can see a rough mapping between brain structures, these neural properties, and the kinds of minds or kinds of systems that I am appealing to. Again, the autonomic system, instinctive system, associative system, and reasoning system. And we can see as the organism is interacting with the world, each of these systems are going to respond to some extent, depending on the particulars of the environment. And then there is a single behavior, certain actions that the environment is generating in response to the stimulation. This response, this behavior, these actions are a sort of an integrated function of the outputs of these different systems. So if you're following the story so far, it should be obvious to you at this point that I've got a major problem. On the one hand, I want to say that these are distinct systems, right? And let me repeat myself to emphasize that. So the autonomic system is based on homeostasis and reflex arcs. Instinctive system is explained as consisting of fixed action patterns triggered by reward and arousal systems. The associative mind is about learning through reinforcement, and the reasoning mind is about coherence relations between propositional attitudes. So, so that's one thing I want to say. The second thing I want to say is that the outputs of these different systems, all these systems are responding, but behavior consists of some sort of blended response of the outputs of these systems. And so this implies a global integration function that takes input from each system and determines a blended response. The conundrum, the problem that I have, is to explain how there can be integration across the levels in the absence of a common language. And so now I am going to make my first controversial move. I think what I've said up to this point is uncontroversial, and I think most people will be on board. But now, as I say, I'm ready to make my first controversial move. So the answer that I want to provide for this puzzle, for this conundrum that I'm facing, is that feelings provide the common currency, allowing for communications across levels and for calculation of overall response to a given situation. Okay? So feelings are the lingua franca for communications across multiple systems. And where I'm going with this is nicely captured by a quotation from Paul Thomas Young, who we'll come back to in a few slides. So he wrote that the postulate that affective processes have an objective existence, that they intervene between stimulus and response, has great utility. Experimental findings practically demand such a hypothesis. Okay, so this is where we're going. So first of all, let me say what I mean by feelings. What are feelings? Well, feelings span the range of sensations from the kink in my neck, the sunshine on my face, hunger pangs, the taste of chocolate cake, sexual arousal, and pangs of jealousy and anger. Now, feelings are not emotions. This is very important. Do not confuse my use of the term feelings with the term emotions. Though emotional states have feelings, hence I've included jealousy and anger among feelings. But the notice I've sort of put it in different color text to note that they're emotional states. So feelings share valence, physiological arousal, and temporal duration components with emotions. But unlike feelings, emotions also have intentional objects, physiological expression, and cognitive antecedents associated with them. So what I'm claiming is that feelings act as antecedents to behavioral outcomes. For example, hunger pangs initiate food finding and eating behavior. The burning sensation on my hand causes me to withdraw it from the flame. Without the hunger pangs or burning sensation, the behavior would not occur. So let's discuss the origins of feelings. So feelings are generated in the brainstem, diencephalon, and subcortical structures, which appear very early and have been conserved certainly in mammals and perhaps in all vertebrates. Thus, feelings may be widely available along the phylogenetic tree. So here, on the top here, we have a rat brain, and here we've got a coronal slice, and here a section, and here we've got a human brain. The coronal slice at the same point, and the section mid-sagittal. And what you can see here, what this diagram is showing you, that the same systems are implicated in the rat brain and in the human brain. for these feeling circuits, for these feeling systems. The second thing that is being shown here is here we've got the insertion of electrode in a rat brain in the septal nucleus region. And what happens when we do this, the rat likes it. It wants you to do it again and again and again. Here we've got the insertion of electrode in the septal nucleus region of a human brain. And this is obviously done for clinical reasons. But the end result is the human likes it. And at least in one case, they report feelings of sexual arousal. Here in these bottom slides, we're showing further details, which are not particularly necessary for present purposes. Okay, so what is I want to claim, it's very important for my story, to claim that feelings sort of have a causal role between stimulus and response. What's the evidence for this? Well, I have to be sort of upfront about this and acknowledge there is no knockdown argument that I can give you for the causal efficacy of feelings. However, there are some neuroscience considerations pointing in this direction. The first one I've already noted on the previous slide. Feelings are generated in brainstem structures widely available along the phylogenetic tree. Second, when these feeling circuits are artificially stimulated, the animals will work to maintain the stimulation. They like it. The stimulation of the circuits can be used as a reward to condition the animal's behavior, just like food and sex. The animals develop place preference aversion, place preference or place aversion as a result of stimulation. Animals will work harder, run faster, the more pleasurable they find the stimulation. And finally, nature is not prodigal, yet feeling circuits have been preserved despite the heavy metabolic cost. Therefore, they must have some adaptive function. I want to claim that feelings are evolution's solution to selecting and initiating actions. That is, feelings are causally efficacious. So let me walk you through an example of this with energy management systems, that is, eating systems. So feelings of reward, wanting and liking, and aversion discussed, serve as intervening variables between stimulus and response. Let's discuss how. So consider the oral sensory system of taste discrimination. Sweetness signals fast-releasing carbohydrate energy sources and motivates consumption. The taste and texture of fat signals high-density energy sources, also motivating consumption. Bitterness signals the presence of noxious toxins and poisons, inhibiting consumption. So taste is the interface and guardian between the external environment of potential foods and our internal bodily environment, stimulus and response. And the liking component affects what is consumed and the amount consumed. So that's one part of the story. So the second part of the story is that the taste system may guide my selection of food, but how do I know when to eat? And why should I make the effort to do so? Why should I bother? Well, the reason I bother is that there's a homeostatic system signaling it is time to eat by generating hunger pangs. This is a restless, unpleasant, agitating feeling which the organism wants to get rid of. These feelings are drivers, motivators, and inhibitors. They activate certain action tendencies, which result in the organism eventually undertaking the actions to procure and ingest food. So the next point I want to note or emphasize is that feelings are critical to each of the non-cognitive systems that I've been discussing. And here, if you go back to this literature, there's, as I said, there's at least 100-year literature on this. If you go back to this literature, what you will notice is that you cannot give an account of autonomic systems, instinctive systems, and associative systems without incorporating the notion of feelings. So in case of the autonomic system, think of hunger pangs, think of your heart racing. Whenever the autonomic system requires interventions of instinctive, associative, and reasoning systems, this is how it solicits those systems. So we've talked about the effect of hunger pangs. Think of suppose you decide, your reasoning mind decides you're going to run 10 miles. You start running. If you don't have chest pains or shortness of breath, you'll continue running, and eventually you'll fall dead. The system is set up to ensure that you don't do that. Is you begin to experience the unpleasant feeling of shortness of breath, the very unpleasant feeling of chest pains. And so you stop, you change the behavior. Instinctive minds think of taste, lust, your child in distress. Instinctive behavior is not like unfelt reflexes, but involves an element of appetite or aversion or both. And initiating in the behavior that is consummating the behavior is pleasurable, and animals seek the opportunity to do so. Associative minds. Well, the behaviorists spend 50 plus years arguing that we don't need to appeal to mental states, certainly not to feelings. But the fact of the matter is that they cannot explain reinforcement in a non-secular way without having the animal distinguish positive and negative valence and prefer the former. And this is where some of the experiments of Paul Young, who I mentioned earlier, play an important role. They help to clarify this. So Paul Young was a behaviorist, a psychologist who worked during the 50s and 60s. He was also a PhD student of Titchener. So he comes from a particular pedigree which acknowledges the role of feelings. He did two sets of experiments, a series of experiments. In the first set of experiments, he identified the flavors that his rats liked, and he was able to rate them. They liked this better than this, better than this, better than this. In a second set of experiments, he used those foods, water solution, sugar solutions, those foods, to train the animals in various types of behaviors. And he had two relevant findings, two important findings. The first one was, unless the animal was disgusted by a particular food, as long as they were okay with it, you were able to use it to train the animal. However, the second finding is the important one for our purposes. It is that the more that the animal liked that particular flavor, the fewer trials it took. That is, they learned much quicker in many fewer trials. Secondly, they ran faster. If they had to push something, a block, they pushed harder. So the liking component, the feeling, the component, the liking component, was causally efficacious in the behavior of these animals. So now I've got a story whereby feelings can serve to connect autonomic systems, instinctive systems, and associative systems. But what about reasoning systems? So the one thing that everyone that studies reasoning is adamant about is reasoning has nothing to do with emotions and feelings. And in fact, there's a 2,000-year-old tradition going back very eloquently to Seneca, who argues that these are two different worlds, and then reason must rule the passions. So now I want to make my second controversial move, perhaps even more controversial than the first move. I want to argue that reason is also about feelings. Okay? And if I can successfully argue this, if I can convince you of this, then I've got an account whereby feelings can connect up autonomic systems, instinctive systems, and reasoning systems. So reasoning doesn't dangle or float above the neurobiology. It is we can sort of connect it to evolutionary older systems. Okay, so this is the strategy here. This is where we're going. So how do I convince you that the reasoning mind is also about feelings. Well, one obvious entry point that for feelings into the cognitive mind that everyone will accept are emotions, though no one has any clue of how really to do this, but that's a separate issue. So I'm going to set emotions aside. What I want to discuss is beliefs, desires, and coherence relations. And the reason I want to discuss these is, remember, when I introduced the reasoning mind, I said there were three components: beliefs, desires, coherence relations. So I want to ask the question, can we attribute feelings to each of these? And I want to answer, yes, we can. So in terms of desires, I want to argue that, well, desires are just cognitive versions of Panksepp's seeking system or Burridge and Kringelbach's wanting system. These are the systems that we study in rats. There is something it feels like to want to complete this book or this submit this article or give this talk. I'm not, and the only thing that differentiates our desires from the desires of non-human animals is the presence of propositional content. Secondly, beliefs are also, I think, have a component of feelings associated with them. And here, the way I make this argument is by going back to John Searle's famous Chinese room argument from the 1980s. The reason this argument raised such a fuss, that it exercised almost everyone in the cognitive science community for about a decade, is that what Searle was actually saying, implicitly saying, was that he didn't understand the Chinese writing because it didn't feel like he didn't understand. It didn't feel like so. And I think he was making an argument for feelings associated with beliefs. And the third component, coherence. I think all logical intuitions come down to a feeling of rightness. Coherence feels right, positive valence. Incoherence or inconsistency feels wrong, negative valence. So let me say a little bit about coherence. So take the following proposition. Either Socrates is mortal, or it's not the case that Socrates is mortal. And I ask you, is this proposition true? You're all certain that it's true. But if I don't see the truth of this proposition, and I'm not ready to accept it, and I ask you to prove it to me, what do you do? Well, in classical logic, what you do is you appeal to the principle of the excluded middle. But if I can't understand the principle of the excluded middle, if I refuse to accept the principle and ask you to prove the principle to me, what do you do? Well, there is no further proof. The principle is meant to be self-evident. It is accepted because it feels right. Clarence Irving Lewis once said, a point of logic being in question, the only thing we can do is appeal to intuition. But why should this be? Why should there be a feeling associated with coherence relations? Well, as in the case of taste, the feeling is fitness enhancing. Coherency feels good because representations that are internally consistent and veridical will enhance survival. Incoherency is unpleasant because it can be harmful. Okay, so that's the third piece of argumentation evidence that I want to offer you. Now, the fourth point has to do with the control structure. Who is in charge of the tethered mind? Well, here is where I make my third controversial move. There is no central executive. There's no I that is sitting above on top and controlling the system, right? That there is no homunculus. There's no Cartesian theater. This is not a dual mechanism account. Where I'm going with this, what I want to appeal to in terms of control structure, is I want to reach back to the 1850s and Jeremy Bentham, who said nature has placed mankind under the governance of two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. So let's talk about the control structure. Here is that same diagram I showed you earlier about the tethered mind. So again, we see the different systems: reasoning, associative, instinctive, autonomic, with the different sort of underlying conceptual mechanisms. And now we can say what the output of these different systems is in terms of feelings, which are defined in terms of valence, arousal, and temporal duration. And then we've got some sort of integration function here that, or you can think of it as a utility function, integration function, that takes the input from these different systems and generates a behavioral response. And as I say, you can think of it as a utility function as originally postulated by Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill, before it was corrupted, I think, by modern economists. Originally, it was a measure of pleasure or satisfaction. So the system is set up to maximize pleasure and minimize pain or displeasure. There is no one in charge. There is no central executive. The control system mechanism is built into the architecture, into the biology. The selected behavior will be a blended response based on the output or some or all systems. The reasoning system has an input into the response, but so do the other systems. Individual differences in behavior are explained not just in terms of individual differences at the level of reasoning or at the level of beliefs, but also individual differences at the level of autonomic, instinctive, and associative systems. It's a very important point. A notion of variable individual effort may be captured in this model by variability in levels of arousal associated with different systems. And once you know the biology of a particular behavior that you are interested in, that is, once you have some understanding of the underlying neurobiology, you can flesh this model out to a considerable extent. Here I show you an example of this model fleshed out for energy management systems. Okay, so this is the model of tethered rationality that I want to present you with. Now let's see how well it works. So I want to show you two examples of how it works. So first is the parole judge's example, because we've already discussed this. So given an application with some merit, the reasoning system may generate a rate ranging from neutral to positive. This will be associated with a positive valence and some amount of arousal. If, however, the judge adjudicating the case also happens to be hungry, the autonomic system will be signaling negative valence and high arousal associated with hunger. The two issues are logically unrelated, but neurologically it is one system. Therefore, one can imagine the negative feelings associated with hunger overpowering or at least dampening down the neutral to positive feelings associated with the evaluation of the case, resulting in a negative parole decision. If the judge has had a good meal, the positive feelings of fullness and contentment may well push a neutral or even positive feelings associated with the evaluation of the case over the top, resulting in a positive parole decision. Okay. The second example that I want to discuss is the vaccine hesitancy example. This is the issue that Francis Collins was alluding to. So millions of people refuse to get a vaccine in the midst of a pandemic. Now, if we're dealing with an untethered rational mind, that is a purely rational mind, how do we change behavior? We change behavior by changing beliefs. How do we change beliefs? Through education, right? This should work. It did not work for one third of Americans. So what's going on here? What reasoning is involved here? How do we explain this? Well, how do I arrive at the conclusion that vaccination is a rational choice in the midst of a pandemic? Well, unless I'm a specialist in vaccines and viruses, I follow the advice of the specialist. So the reasoning task here is to determine who to believe about vaccine safety and efficacy. Entertainers reading scripts on TV, the internet, the next door neighbor, or the specialists at the CDC who have spent their lives studying viruses and vaccines. This is an appropriate question for the reasoning mind, but the untethered reasoning mind is a myth, as I've been arguing. So how do we explain this? Well, As in the case of low blood sugar level, the parole judge's decision making, there are some non-cognitive processes that work here. And so to discuss these non-cognitive processes, I need to introduce the idea of in-group, out-group. Now, this is an idea that most of you will be familiar with, and you will know that in-groups are good and safe, out-groups are always evil and dangerous. And typically, we discuss group formation as a social construction. I make the case in the book that in-group, out-group formation is an instinct. And I make this case based on the 5 criteria that we discussed above when we were talking about the decision-making literature, the economic decision-making tasks. And so let me remind you what I mean by instincts. Instincts are innate species, sex, gender-specific stereotype behaviors available from birth or within a developmental window that are triggered by specific stimuli. They're mostly hardwired in subcortical systems, but may also be represented in cortex. There's a tight causal connection between stimulus and response. Think about it like imprinting in certain birds. The imprinting is instinctual, but what is imprinted upon is an accidental feature of the environment. Similarly, in-group, out-group formation is an instinct, but group membership is environmentally, socially determined completely. I want to say a few more, make a few more points about instinctive behavior. So I don't like to think of instinctive behavior as automatic, but rather as compulsive. Right? There's something that's driving us in that direction. So it contains an element of appetite or aversion or both. So by appetite, what we mean is that an animal is in a state of agitation in the absence of a stimuli. For example, hunger pangs in the absence of food, or craving for group membership in the absence of membership. And receiving the stimuli, food or membership, is consummatory or satisfying, pleasurable. It relieves the agitation and returns the animal to rest. Aversion is a state of agitation resulting from the presence of a certain stimulus. For example, a spider for certain individuals, or a threat presented by the outgroup, and ceases when the stimulus is withdrawn or destroyed. And so grouping contains both of these elements, both an appetitive element and an aversion element. That is, it contains two, sort of consummating the grouping instinct contains two sources of pleasure. And go some way to explain the compulsiveness of group formation and the pleasure derived from belonging to the in-group. And if the developmental psychologists are to be believed, even the greater pleasure involved in hating the outgroup. So let's return to the vaccine hesitancy situation example. If scientists belong to the in-group, the instinct pushes us in the same direction as reason and enhances the pleasure satisfaction associated with the rational choice. If, however, scientists belong to the outgroup, then the instinct pushes us in the opposite direction. They're evil and trying to deceive us. If the pleasure we derive from exercising this instinct, that is the hostility towards the outgroup, is greater than we derive from the rational choice, then we will be among the vaccine hesitant. If, in addition, the reasoning mind is used against us to sow doubt on the motives of the expert to accentuate group differences, for example, they don't tell you how many people have died from the vaccine, do they? It will be even more difficult to overcome the instinctual bias. Any information to the contrary, no matter how clear or factual, will be less effective because it is pushing in the opposite direction to the instinct. Notice that the same mechanisms and procedures are at play in both the vaccinated and the vaccine hesitant. The only difference is group membership. And so on this model, you do not need to postulate that the vaccine hesitant are irrational or stupid or the same model, same mechanism explains both the vaccine compliant and the vaccine hesitant. The only difference is group membership. The reasoning processes, the other systems at play are the same. So, given this, what are some of the implications for changing behavior? And again, let's stick with the vaccine example. Well, changing beliefs does not work very well. When these beliefs push us in a direction that is inconsistent with the instinct. If it's consistent with the instinct, changing beliefs works very well. So, what are some of the other things we can try? Well, somehow if we can get the vaccine hesitant to expand their in-group to incorporate vaccine scientists, then the pleasure associated with consummating the appetitive state of the instinct will push in the same direction as reason. But this is not easy to do because of the pleasure associated with hating the outgroup. Secondly, we could have the vaccine hesitant feel or experience the suffering and terror of being seriously sick and dying with COVID, hopefully vicariously. And the terror of death should override the pleasure derived from consummating the in-group, out-group instinct and change behavior. Thirdly, we can offer sufficient punishment and reward, that is, appeal to the associative mind, associative mechanisms, to tip the balance away from the pleasure associated with the in-group membership towards the pleasure associated with the coherent choice. And here you might think of what did and did not work during the anti-smoking campaigns that occurred in North America during the 1980s. Okay, last slide in conclusion. So I've covered a lot of ground, some of it new and controversial in a short space of time. So the argument may seem overly brief and abstract. But here I have taken the trouble of pointing you to the appropriate chapters in the book on the various slides. My basic message is, I think, very straightforward and intuitively plausible. Human behavior is a blended response generated by autonomic, instinctive, and associative and reasoning systems. Each of these systems is associated with different conceptual and neural machinery. One key insight that holds everything together is that feelings, generated in old, widely conserved brainstem structures, are evolution's solution to initiating and selecting all behaviors and provide the common currency for the different systems to interact. Reason is as much about feelings as is lust and the taste of chocolate cake. All systems contribute to behavior, and the overall control structure is one that maximizes pleasure and minimizes displeasure. Such an account drives human behavior back into the biology, where it belongs, and provides a richer set of tools to understand how we pursue food, sex, and politics. Thank you.